Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org. We're a nonprofit newsroom where we do investigative journalism to root out corruption in the state of Connecticut. My name is Connor Dragotis. I'm the managing editor here, and today I am joined by Catherine Revelo, investigative reporter, transparency expert. Any other tags that you want to throw on your name, Catherine, as we get into this show today?
No, I think we can start there.
Okay, that's perfect. Obviously, we are talking, as we so often do with you, about transparency because that is the bulk of your work here. You do a fantastic job, not just identifying, or rather bringing records to light, but also identifying the problems to that even being possible. It seems like there's hardly a week that passes where we are not having a conversation about someone who's flaunting the law or throwing up crazy stonewalling tactics. It's become somewhat of a running joke. I mean, I think in Connecticut generally, but certainly in our newsroom, that if you want records, man, we're gonna have to fight tooth and nail for them. Is that a fair place to kick this off as we start about the Department of Corrections?
Yeah, I think so, right? I remember when we first started doing Transparency Update, we were a little concerned about filling a biweekly slot with that kind of stuff, and man, that certainly hasn't been an issue, is it?
No, it's if anything, I feel like you're, trying to talk about which story is just most important or which has the most relevant update. Um, no, definitely no shortage of content, news or investigations for transparency. And again, ideally, we want to be writing stories that are the result of transparency. We've requested records, we get them. We are able to answer a substantive question that helps and serves our readers and the people of Connecticut broadly as part of our mission to root out corruption. But instead, I'd say a fair amount of the time, we're getting jammed up with bureaucracy, willful negligence, or ignoring the standards that be, or just gosh darn it, plain bad record keeping that you also seem to have become an educator in the state of Connecticut, where you're speaking to public officials and folks who are supposed to be maintaining or publishing various records, and they just aren't doing it. Uh, let's talk about record confusion. It's your newest investigation. It's about banned books and disappearing DOC records. Uh, talk about the inception of this too. I know banned books is kind of an interesting topic that has spanned a couple years now.
Yeah, and I mean, this is one of those stories, and we've had a bunch of them because the state is so bad at record keeping that started out being about banned books and ended up being something completely different. Oh, banned book lists are notoriously difficult to get in a lot of states. We know that there is, a lot of value, I think, in knowing not only, what books are being banned, but the decision processes that are behind what books are being banned, because a lot of times, what you see and from people who are experts in this area is the policies about which books get banned in prisons come down ultimately not necessarily to a policy, but to individuals in DOC who are doing the review. So we initially did a story a couple of years ago about a banned books list that Pen America was able to obtain, and we wanted to dig a little deeper into it. And banned books lists can tell us some things, but they don't really give us the background on how the decisions about bans are being made, how they're being fought, if there are, certain members of prison populations that are being targeted. So what we really were looking for with this request was not necessarily to get just a list of books that are banned, but to be able to tell a deeper and broader story. And instead, what we found is just horrific record keeping by the Department of Corrections, which, between you and me, Connor, I think we knew we were going to run into because we have run into it multiple times before. But this was a FOIA request that spanned, I think, 10 months from start to finish. And at one point, we were quoted over $1,000 for a category of records which had to do with communications from the prison population, and between prison officials dealing with appeals of books that had been banned from being circulated into DOC facilities. And at one point, we were quoted over $1,000. We were told several thousand pages of records had been located. And then all of a sudden, we were told actually those records don't exist. And not only do actually those records don't exist, but when we were like, okay, but if that's the case, where did this quote come from? We were basically told we don't know. And, you go in, you read this. This is one of these stories that the majority of the story is about this FOIA request and doing battle with DOC over it. And you can go in and read it. It's long, it's complicated, but, we involved the public records administrator at one point because DOC was telling us that records that they are required to maintain under the state record retention schedule, they actually weren't required to maintain. In the end, we did get the records. They told us they didn't exist. And we found, just horrific record keeping. We found multiple discrepancies and all sorts of issues um, contained in these documents that they did turn over.
I definitely agree that we anticipated issues based on our prior experience with DOC. It's such an interesting part of government generally, but it tends to also, uh, well, the way that they approach the job, right? I mean, there's a it's a segment of the population where it's difficult. It's just hard to deal with people who are already incarcerated, right? I do, however, have optimism every time we hit the send button on a FOIA request, and maybe that's just me, being a silver lining guy. But I want to believe that we're going to be helpful, right? Build relationships with these people. And you said this before. You said the state is bad at record keeping, and the only point of clarification that I'd make there is, at the end of the day, it's individual human beings, right, who are either doing the job they're supposed to be doing or not doing the job they're supposed to be doing. But those individuals can learn, right? They can become better. We can develop partnerships. We can actually help. I mean, part of rooting out corruption isn't just, hey, we got you, right? That type of journalism. In many ways, a good bit of the work that you do, but I think everyone on our team does, is coming alongside these folks who, for one reason or another, are not following through on what is required by the law as public employees, and saying, hey, what's actually going on here? And whether that becomes a story or not, we hope that the downstream effects is less corruption, less failure to follow through on making this information available. I mean, on the other side of that, and maybe you could speak to this a little bit, we can't always find out who is doing the job poorly, right? I think at one point in this process, I asked you, hey, this is an interesting list of rejections. Who actually decides what books shouldn't be given to inmates? And I think where we ended up on that is kind of a shrug, right? I mean, we can't always find out who is the decision maker, and that makes it very hard to partner with them, to build relationships, to do education, and ideally end the poor practice. You run into that pretty frequently across the board. I mean, do you have optimism about that changing, or are there inroads to be made?
I mean, I don't have optimism about it changing. And I actually don't think this is an instance where this is people just need to do their jobs better. This is an issue with the actual records infrastructure that exists in multiple state agencies, right? We saw this also in the investigation we did a while back where we tried to look at plea bargaining, and ran into basically the system that they have for recording information is old and outdated and goes back essentially to the way that court clerks record things for their convenience. And that's what guides what kind of, data about case outcomes and plea bargains that is available in the state of Connecticut today. It's outdated, it's not functional. And, we see that in DOC a lot too, where every time we put in one of these requests, we come back with, well, we don't maintain records like that, right? When we were doing our investigation about um, interstate prisoner contracts, where the state can move prisoners out of the state and can accept out of state prisoners, we were told, hey, we told DOC we'd like a list of people going back, for so many years, with all these transfers. And we're told basically, well, we can't do that. We can give you the list of people who are in our facilities right now. And with this request, we get told time and time again, well, this is down to the individual facilities, and
Mm.
we have to liaise with the individual facilities. And what you can see from the records that we did receive, which are all linked in this investigation, you can go in and look at them for yourselves, is the way that they are maintained is all different by facility. And I think that does get to your point a little bit, Connor, of there are definitely specifically individuals who need to do their jobs better, that maybe when they're down at these facility levels, we don't necessarily know who they are. And that's an issue when it comes to transparency. And when you multiply that times the number of people who are handling all of these cases independently, who are independently reviewing these publications and saying this is not allowed in the facility. And you can see in some of the appeals that ended up being overturned where somebody else reviewed them and said, actually, there is no content in this that meets the criteria for why it was rejected. I think then it's an issue of there's so many people working independently without oversight that, where do you even begin to try to figure out where the problem is or how to make it better?
Right. So the systems that they are using need to be updated, redesigned.
Yeah,
Basically, I think that it's fair to
right.
say too that Connecticut government is not becoming less complicated or has not in the last
Yes.
50 years. So if you're trying to take a system to for whatever reason, I suppose, and apply it to a new use case, you're going to have big gaps that, loopholes you could drive a truck through,
Yeah.
unfortunately. And the result is that information is going to get lost. So
Yeah,
we need better
absolutely.
design infrastructure here if
Yeah,
we want
and
this information to follow statute and
yeah,
transparency
I mean, and
requirements.
we've complained about GovQA before, which is the online
Yes.
platform that most state agencies use to handle FOIA requests. And one of its severe limitations is, as we have found out from specific requests that we have filed, you can only upload when it's actually like because of the software that they have on their end of it, when the public agencies are working on it, excuse me, it can upload one responsive document to a request. If you're looking for more than that, there's something that happens in the system that it doesn't work as efficiently. Right? And I mean that's obviously insane, right? How many records requests have you filed where you're just looking for one document?
Yeah. That's that's a really, really fair point. It's a very good point. Um, Can we talk a little bit about some of the like rejections themselves too? Because I think that the question that I had mentioned before, the conversation that we had offline about like who's actually doing this, um, stemmed from me starting to take a look at, I guess, which book, like some of the books I guess stood out to me as kind of bizarre to reject. Right, I went to my own bookshelf, I pulled out my copy of Aldous
Yep.
Huxley's,
That
The
was the one
Doors
that
of
stood out to me
Perception.
too. Yep.
Right? Like this
Yeah.
is a book about it's at its core a book about philosophy. I bring it up because A, it's one of my favorite books, so why not take the opportunity to plug it for anyone who hasn't read it? Unfortunately, we're not sponsored by the Huxley estate or anything, but we would love to be. Um, but the reason that they said that it should not be allowed is because it encourages or instructs on the commission of criminal activity, which, the premise of this book is Aldous Huxley used mescaline to get a altered state of mind, and then, basically writes about his experience working with scientists, and, he was his own test subject to a certain extent. And in many cases, I would argue it's a book about peace and beauty and seeing the world in a better way. To see, someone who, maybe I'm being judgmental, but likely uh, is not viewing it through the lens of its philosophical merit, to just be like, no, 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 we're not going to allow this in. It seems like that is a prime example of the way that this can go really, really wrong. And this is a book that I would argue, has changed my life for the better, made me a more peaceful person, made me want to see the world in a better light. To see that robbed from someone who maybe is working to become a better version of themselves while they're behind bars for something they did that hurt others. Oh man, that really got me. I felt kind of bothered and disturbed by the fact that that could even happen.
Right. And I mean, I think that is at the heart of issue with DOC's book ban policy, right? Is there's a number of reasons that publications aren't allowed in. I think probably unsurprisingly, sexually explicit content is, chief up there. It's one of the ones that's most frequently cited. There's a bunch of stuff, I don't think anyone's surprised that Playboy's getting banned, things like that. But there's also a bunch of stuff that um, is in the vein of Aldous Huxley, or we saw a number of anime books that got banned. That there are supposed to be exceptions to this policy for when taken as a whole. A work has artistic or literary, or philosophical content, things of that nature. Um, it seems to me like Aldous Huxley, pretty classic author. I think we all probably read at least one of his works in school, falls into that vein. Um, but there's so much subjectivity in that policy, and this is has been the bane of free speech litigation for forever too, right? Is when does something have artistic merit, and how subjective is that, and who gets to decide what does and doesn't have value? And we can clearly see this here, and we can clearly see it being inappropriate applied, and books like that getting banned, and then being overturned on appeal, because pretty clearly it's not an appropriate use of that policy.
So it basically just comes to I know it when I see it. To throw in some SCOTUS reference here, this is ultimately just going to be someone sitting in a room flipping through a book. I don't even know how much time they're given to review. I mean, I'm of the opinion you should spend 5 or 6 days with this before passing judgment, right? Like, that's not going to be, flip through in 5 minutes and feel like you have a good idea of what's going on. That's obviously an opinion, but again, I think it's an important one to your point. Um, Before we move on to our second topic here, I wanted to ask you briefly about the like appeals process too, because my understanding from these records is that folks they request a book, they get a rejection, but how many other doors to perception type texts were just never challenged because the inmates didn't know they could or didn't understand the process or weren't supported. Like I think it's a black box, so I'm not obviously asking you to answer that fully, but if you could, I guess, make sure that I'm understanding that clearly for our readers, watchers, and listeners here.
Yeah, and I think that is part of the issue here is, you have a limited, once you get a notice that a book or another publication has been rejected, you have a limited window to appeal. And, that appeal process is really determined by DOC. That um, incarcerated population has, they can write a letter basically outlining their argument for why that publication should be allowed, but ultimately it's DOC that is making that final determination. Um, and I'm not satisfied with the view we got into that process, because that was the category of records we were told existed that didn't exist. And then we were turned over what we were told was a complete set of records, but there's numerous discrepancies in those records that were turned over. For example, a bunch of them don't have the letters that were written by inmates appealing those decisions, or the grounds that they were being appealed on.
That is fascinating. Really fantastic investigation. Like we've already talked about, it's kind of one of those ones, and you acknowledge this. I actually loved getting this draft from you because I was like, oh, how's Catherine going to approach the fact that this is a pivot from what was originally imagined, and you literally were like, hey, reader. We had to make a pivot, and here's what this is going to look like. Like, buckle up. Here we go. You did it. You did a good job. I don't know, maybe breaking the fourth wall is the right way to say that, but bringing people in and setting those expectations. It's something I really enjoy about your writing generally is, you are speaking to the reader in a really human way.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and look, we're always going to call public agencies out when they do this stuff, because it's not in keeping with the law, and it's important that people know what's going on. And, I don't like that this is the case, but we have had success in getting records faster, or in getting less pushback when we do this type of stuff,
yeah.
which is good for us, but makes me mad because you shouldn't have to do that. And if you're a normal person who's trying to get answers out of a FOIA, and you don't have that journalistic platform, so that this is unfortunately the issues that we find ourselves facing with FOIA in Connecticut right now.
Man, all right, you're kind of making me want to keep talking about this a little bit, because you just made me think of this fact where we recently published an investigation that had to do with an institution in Connecticut, and the institution never responded to our request for comment. Right, controversial topics, dealing with some kind of difficult stuff, and they reached out and they said, hey, why weren't we quoted? And you didn't respond. And now this, as a result, it was a great investigation. It was really important stuff. There was a public response as a result of what we published. And now all of a sudden they're saying, hey, can we get together for coffee? Can we have a conversation? Can we take this time to dig deeper? And we have had this happen, to your point, time and time and time again, where we can't sit forever and wait for someone to decide that they want to give comment. I think it's a tactic that this isn't just governments either. It's we've seen this in private industry. We've seen it from individuals. Man, if I don't give them a comment, maybe they won't write the article. And we are lucky enough here to have a talented group of individuals where no, we're going to write about what the public needs to know. We're still going to pursue getting rid of corruption. If you don't want to be part of that, man, that's a missed opportunity. That's a true missed opportunity to either clear the air or get into the nuance. Like, let's talk about that a little bit. You love nuance, right? I mean,
Oh, yeah.
that's where the fun is.
Yeah, and I mean, especially these investigations that we do are a lot of times incredibly complex topics.
Yeah,
And, I think the traditional journalistic wisdom is, you need both sides of the story. Oftentimes, there are many more sides of the story than that. And I think we do our best to try to tell all of them. But just because we can't get somebody from every side of the story to give us input doesn't mean that we won't publish it, and I am perfectly happy to write a piece that says, we reached out to so and so for comment and they didn't respond,
yeah.
so
What are you going to do? Again, this is if they're matters of public interest, if they fall within our mission, we are actually. I feel like that there's an obligation. I mean,
yeah.
we have all agreed to be here as part of this company to root out corruption. And oh shucks, something horrible happened, but they won't talk about it. So all of this other information is going to go by the wayside. No, of course not. We are always going to do our due diligence to at least put it out there though, right? Make it possible. And I think even when it's pretty clear cut, there's already been a finding of wrongdoing. Some of the most interesting stuff that we've published, and I think has with having the greatest human impact, has been those where we're able to at least say, Alex's toothless investigation comes to mind, right? A dentist found guilty of fraud, but Alex went out there and spoke with her about, she's not American by birth, and the culture of corruption and bribes and payoffs that led her to believe, you know what, this is kind of a lesser way that I could make sure that my dental practice is able to survive. And so I didn't really think it was the wrong thing. I'm obviously vastly oversimplifying here. Alex's investigation is a really important and good read there. But when we can do that, I do feel like that human element allows our readers to at least take that next step toward empathy, toward compassion, and also toward opening their eyes to corruption that might be happening in their own community. Right? I mean, could you talk a little bit about that? I mean, how do you see that as part of your job? Is the eyeball opening to hopefully help people see this stuff in their own lives and do something about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the reasons I talk about FOIA incessantly because it is a tool that is available not just for people like me, but for anybody out there to go and get answers out of the public officials who work for you. And we have talked a lot about this specific problem, I think, in the context of the reporting we have done on UConn and CSCU, and the sexual abuse allegations that we have seen come out of those schools. And we haven't always had the full story when we have decided to publish those. And that's largely because those schools don't want to talk to us, which is their right. Their lawyers have a job to do. Fine. But it is important for us, I think, not to just let that be a black box that sits there, that where no one knows these harms are going on and are being continually perpetuated because there's kind of a smokescreen around it, and so nobody knows what's happening.
Yeah. I feel the same way about family court, actually. That's another one where people, contentious divorces, battling over kids, battling over huge sums of money. You always have an attorney who says, oh, no, we don't want to talk about this in the media. And that's fine. But especially when there's a very robust court record, I've been very thankful for Mark's work to, go and actually build relationships with people who, man, they have turned away uh, the ability, talking about their issues in the public forum. But when you get into the details, holy cow, we've gotten thousands of people who have reached out because of the bravery of two or three who are willing to talk about financial malfeasance or pressure tactics, the way that the law is turned on its head. Without that kind of courage, I don't know. It gets the world can be made a better place through journalism. I truly believe that. I think we see that we brought it into reality. Credit to our reporters on that. Um, I don't know that I have a specific point there, other than just this call to the public to remember that you have power to make things better. We are obviously here as a partner for that, but in so many cases, it requires the courage of a whistleblower or a tipster or someone who has experienced something, and instead of doing exactly what the corrupt individual would want them to do, go hide in their basement and not talk to anyone. They go to the talented Catherine Revelo or the esteemed Mark Fitch or any reporter in Connecticut. Frankly, I am partial to ours because our folks are wonderful. But we can help you make a serious difference in your community, in this state, and we want our work to have a personal, measurable impact on improving your life.
Yeah, and just to add that, I think one of the conversations we have behind the scenes a lot is sometimes we get tips with people who have a story but are afraid of what the consequences will be. And, I think we understand that it's scary, especially when you're looking at something that could potentially upend your life or your livelihood. We take journalistic ethics very seriously
Yeah.
and do our best to make sure that we are going to protect you, and do everything to tell that story in a way that is going to do the least amount of damage to you. But we also do need something to work with. We need things like documents. We need things like, names or anything that's on the public record that we can sink our teeth into, you know.
Yeah, we don't write on vibes for sure.
Yes.
Really important.
There's a lot of media out there that does. We don't do that. So.
Hopefully that shows through in the final product. I believe that for sure. Um, all right, we didn't get to Bridgeport today. I know we were like, we should talk about some of the many topics. Bridgeport loses
Good news,
labor
I think
dispute.
Bridgeport's issues will probably continue until next time.
Spoiler alert, we think that there will be more to write there. Yeah, school audits, labor disputes over the replacement of an alleged ballot stuffer. Take a look at our website, insideinvestigator.org. Check those out too. Really important articles, not just if you live in Bridgeport, but to get an idea of really, I mean, how education and elections are unfolding across the state of Connecticut. Bridgeport just happens to have a pretty big magnifying glass on it by state regulators and also many reporters. Catherine, thanks for taking the time today to chat about this stuff. Great investigation. Obviously, everyone should go and read it immediately. Grab a cup of coffee, and well, I know we release this sometimes Friday night, so maybe not a cup of coffee, but take a look at her work. I also want to point out. Obviously, this week's episode is not live. We talked about that we are moving toward doing this program live every other week, maybe even getting to an every week schedule. Schedules didn't work out this week. We want to make sure that our tech is perfect as we bring it to the public. So keep an eye. We'll definitely have Mark on in the next one to chat about some really interesting topics, including companies and individuals who want to protect their brand instead of providing information to the media. It's a really important topic, and I think it'll be really helpful for anyone with a story to tell. If you want to become a donor to our nonprofit, please head over to insideinvestigator.org. We're just wrapping up our summer fundraising series, and the hundreds of people who have supported us, huge thank you for allowing us to do this work and pursue our mission. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.